I think you'll have to change it because it's on. Go back down there. Okay, Assalamu alaikum everyone. And welcome to the Children's Majlis program for Muharram. So tonight is which night of Muharram? Yes, Imran. Is it the 11th night? It's the 12th night. Today is the 11th day of Muharram. So it's the night before the 12th. So it's the 12th night of Muharram. And we will be talking about what happened on the day after Ashura. Okay, that's going to be our lesson today. So we're going to find out or remember the injustice that were committed against the survivors of Karbala. Remember, we said that Imam Hussain and all the men in his caravan, his family members, his companions were all martyred. The ones who were all well and old enough to go to battle were all martyred. Who was left behind? It was the women, the children, and there was one man. Who was that man? Hania? Imam Zainul Abidin, who couldn't go to battle because he was, let's see, Arman? He was very sick that day. On the day of Ashura, he was very ill, so he couldn't go to fight. So these were the survivors of Karbala, and we're going to find out what happened to them. We're going to discover how the mission of Imam Hussain continued after his death. We have talked a little bit about it before, how the story of what happened in Karbala on the day of Ashura and the days leading up to that, how that story was spread to the Muslim Ummah. We're going to talk about that as well. And we're going to show that the ultimate victory, did the victory belong to Yazid or to Imam Hussain? We're going to see that in this lesson, and I'm sure some of you also know it in your minds from what you've heard. Now, the verse for today comes from Surah An-Nisa. That's the 4th surah of the Quran, and this verse is verse number 76. And in this verse, Allah says, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alladhina amanu yuqatiluna fi sabilillah. Those who have faith fight in the way of Allah. And then he continues, and those who are faithless, those who don't have faith, fight in the way of fake gods. Okay? So, fight the friends of Satan. Indeed, the stratagems or the ways in which Shaitan works are always flimsy. Now, remember the first part. Those who have faith fight in the way of Allah. And what is the way of Allah in this verse? Alladhina amanu, that is the people who believe, yuqatiluna, they fight, fi sabilillah means in the way of Allah. So remember that, because sometimes when you do things, when you do a good thing, you can have the intention or the niyyah that this is fi sabilillah. If you help someone, if you're kind to someone who needs your help, if you help your parents at home to do something, you can always have that intention, this is fi sabilillah, and you will be doing the things the same way that those who have faith do, because you will be part of walladhina amanu. Okay? So remember, when you do anything good, always say this is in the way of Allah, in the name of Allah, because Allah would like me to do this. Whether it is smiling at someone, because smiling is it's a gift that you can give. In Islam, smiling has thawab. If you smile someone, you make them happy, that is a good thing that you're doing as well. Yes? Good. Okay. All right, so that's what we're going to learn in today's lesson. And the key word for today is Shame Ghariba. So Shame Ghariba is the night of the dispossessed. Yes, Isa, what were you going to tell me about Shame Ghariba? Shame Ghariba was the evening when the tents got burned. So remember we talked about Ashura being the 10th day of Muharram? Shame Ghariba was that evening of that 10th of Muharram. Okay, it was the evening when Yazid's army, having killed the men of the caravan, including Imam Hussain, then they came and they did a lot of injustices, particularly to the women and to the bodies of all the shaheed that were there. And that night was a very, very sad and horrific night for those women and children because it was very, very difficult for them. They didn't have anyone to protect them. There was no Hazrat Abbas, there was no Imam Hussain, there was only Imam Zainul Abidin, who was a man and he was sick, so he couldn't do much to protect the women. So that is Shame Ghariba, and we will be talking a lot about the events of Shame Ghariba. Okay, so in this verse that we talked about in Surah Nisa, Allah speaks about those who fight in the way of Allah, and He shows how the believers fight the friends of Shaitan. He says that Shaitan's strategy or Shaitan's methods are very weak. On the day of Ashura, in the events that took place on that day, we can see how Imam Hussain and his companions fought in the way of Allah against the evil ways of Yazid and his army, and how ultimately Shaitan's strategy was weak. On the day of Ashura, we learned that Imam Hussain and his companions and his family members were killed while they were thirsty. The army of Umar Sa'd didn't stop there. Umar Sa'd then ordered men to trample over the body of Imam with their horses. So once the Imam was shaheed, once he had died and his body was on the battlefield, Umar Sa'd sent some men on horses and told them to take their horses over the body of the Imam. Imam's clothes and belongings were stolen, and he was left on the plains of Karbala without a burial. Even though he was the grandson of Rasulullah, he and the rest of the Ahlul Bayt were treated with disrespect. The rest of the Shuhada, the rest of the men and family members and companions of Imam Hussain who were martyred, their bodies were also beheaded, so their heads were cut off from their bodies. This was a thing that they did in those days, and then the heads were put on top of spears and taken around and paraded through the streets of Kufa and Sham. Yes.
They were so merciless that even after the event took place, they were still mocked them and say, "Oh look, we had a victory against the grandson of the Prophet," and they were boasting that they killed the grandson of the Prophet.
That's right. They were not scared or ashamed of the fact that they had killed the grandson of the Prophet. They were pleased. They were mocking the family of the Prophet. They were mocking the Ahlul Bayt, and they thought that they had done the right thing. Yes. We're going to talk about that just now, yes. So what happened on Sham Ghariba? That's the night of 11th Muharram. So when the 10th day was over and Maghrib happened, it was the 11th night of Muharram. And this was the Maghrib after the day when Imam Hussain was killed. The women and children had lost their beloved family members. They had lost their fathers or brothers. They were treated very cruelly and they were robbed of everything that they owned. Umar Sa'd entered the tents of the Ahlul Bayt and he looted all the belongings of the women and the children. And Then they set fire to the tents. So what happened? Then the women and children had to leave the tents. They had to come out to save their lives. They ran from one tent to the children screamed and ran from one tent to the other because they were worried, they were scared. And eventually they all had to come out of their tents to save their life. And in fact, Bibi Zainab, remember Imam Zainul Abidin was very sick that day. Bibi Zainab had to help Imam Zainul Abidin out of the tent so that his life would be saved because he was now the Imam of the time. This was surely a night of sorrow and sadness. It was Sham-e Ghariba. Sham means evening or night, and Ghariba means those people who have no home or no place to be. The women and children had lost everything and they were forced to sleep outside in the cold desert air. Remember, they were hungry, they were thirsty, and they were scared. And this was the first night after they had lost all their beloved family members. What happened next? On the next day, on the day of 11th Muharram, Umar Saad and his soldiers buried the dead shuhada while buried their own dead. So the people from their army who had died were buried, but the bodies of Imam Hussain and his companions were left uncovered without any kafan. You know what is a kafan? It is the cloth that dead bodies are covered in before they're buried. So they left these shuhada uncovered on the field of Karbala. And they took the women and the children, chained them or tied them up with ropes, and forced them to mount on camels without any coverings or anything like that. So there were no saddles on the camel. Let me finish what I'm reading, if that's okay. This was very uncomfortable and it was very safe. Have you ever been on a camel? Have you ever ridden a camel? How is it? It's very bumpy because remember, a camel is very tall. And if you're going to mount on a camel, if you're going to climb a camel, the camel has to sit down and then you can climb on the camel when it has a saddle. And then when the camel stands up, it gets up so that you lean forward or you're leaning backwards or something like that because it's very tall and it cannot just get up on 4 feet the way we do. It actually is quite a bumpy thing. So unfortunately, the women and children did not have camels with saddles. It was a very uncomfortable and very bumpy trip for those who were on the camels, and the rest of them had to walk. Imam Zainul Abidin was also chained and an iron collar was put around his neck. Even though he was very ill, he was forced to walk all the way from Karbala to Kufa. And on this journey that they took, they passed the battlefield of Karbala, and the women and children had to see the uncovered dead bodies of their loved ones. There was no consideration from Umar Saad or his men that these women and these children might be sad to see their father or their brother or their child lying dead like that. Yes, very quickly, please. That's right, I remember that as well. Very good remembering. Sakina, quickly, please. The camels did not have any saddles, and some of the women had to be on camels, but it was very uncomfortable. Most of them had to walk, and they were all tied up with a rope, and they were all connected to each other. So it was, again, tall, short, didn't matter how it was. They all were connected and tied by ropes. It was very difficult for them to walk in this way. All right, now, it has been narrated probably by someone like that journalist or someone who was writing, a narrator who was watching. He was not on Yazid's side, he was not on the side of the Ahlul Bayt, he was just a neutral person who was watching and writing down the history of what was happening on that day. So someone like that narrated that Bibi Sakina, the daughter of Imam Hussain, when she saw Imam Hussein's body, she threw herself on the body and she did not want to leave him, because it is said that Bibi Sakina used to sleep on Imam Hussein's chest every night. She used to sleep every night with her father. So imagine how the night of Sham-e Ghariba would have been for her, because she was not able to sleep with her father that night. And the Ahlul Bayt were forced to move towards Kufa, where people in Kufa had been told that some rebels, some people who have gone against Yazid are now arriving, and they gathered together in the streets and the bazaars, ready to mock these people who were rebelling against Yazid, who were that's what they had been told. On the next morning, the Ahlul Bayt were paraded as prisoners through the streets of Kufa and then taken to Ubaidullah ibn Ziyad's palace. Ubaidullah, remember, was the cruel governor of Kufa who had first turned the people of Kufa against Imam Hussain. Remember, the people of Kufa had offered to give Imam Hussain their support, and then they were bribed and tricked and threatened by Ubaidullah, and they slowly, one by one, changed their mind till nobody in Kufa was ready to be on Imam Hussein's side. The heads of the shuhada were mounted on spears, and they were with the captives who had been tied up in ropes, and Imam Zainul Abidin in chains. The army of Umar Sa'd acted as though they were victorious war heroes, and the Ahlul Bayt were the prisoners and the rebels. The Ahlul Bayt were treated like slaves, and they were given no respect as they were marched through the streets. However, the behavior of the Ahlul Bayt was very strong, and they were very steadfast. They were brave, they were patient. When people asked who they were, they would tell them that we are the Ahlul Bayt. Do you remember the Prophet? Do you remember Rasulullah? We are his family. In fact, I think we have discussed a few different events in the past where people would ask, or they would mock at the Ahlul Bayt, and Imam Zainul Abidin and Bibi Zainab would stand up and tell them patiently who they really were and who was right and who had been the wrongdoer in this battle. And people were shocked, and they began to be sad when they realized that this was actually the family of Rasulullah and that they had been wronged in this way. And the news started spreading, and Muslims started to become angry when they learned, because it had just been a short while ago that the Kufans had all been on Imam Hussein's side, and they realized how they had been tricked and threatened by Yazid to change sides. And slowly, with this parading of the Ahlul Bayt and with Bibi Zainab and Imam Zainul Abidin and the other women saying the truth of what had happened, the people of Kufa began to realize that they had made a mistake. And so, similarly, when Bibi Zainab, Imam Zainul Abidin and the captives arrived at the palace of Ubaidullah, again they gave many khutbahs. Do you remember what khutbah is, Amina? A sermon. They gave some really strong and powerful khutbahs against Yazid, so that people realized what had happened and all the injustices that had taken place. So what happened as a result of all this is that Ubaidullah began to get worried that people in Kufa were going to start changing their minds, and he decided to send them to Sham, which is Damascus. Damascus is the capital of the country that is Syria today, and that was Yazid's capital. Yazid was in Sham, and so the women and children and Imam Zainul Abidin had this next journey all the way to Sham. When they reached Sham, it was the same situation. They were paraded through the streets and led to the palace of Yazid, which was actually a mosque at that time. It was called the Umayyad Mosque. Umayyad was the name of the family of the Yazid and the rulers at that time. They were the Umayyads. That was their family name. So the mosque was called the Umayyad Mosque. When the Ahlul Bayt and their companions were brought before Yazid, he taunted them, he made fun of them, and he ridiculed them, and he told them, I am the one who has been victorious. You are the losers. You've lost your Hussein, you've lost your family. You have been unsuccessful, and you are my prisoners. It has been said that Yazid had a stick, and with that stick he poked the head of Imam Hussein, and he also recited poetry which was anti-Islamic. There was a companion of Rasulullah who was present there, and he cried at Yazid to stop. And again, Bibi Zainab and Imam Zainul Abidin gave their powerful khutbahs, at that time, which led everyone to tears. The Muslims became ashamed of what they had allowed Yazid to do to the Ahlul Bayt. Remember what we said about Bibi Zainab. When Bibi Zainab spoke, when she gave her sermons and khutbahs, whom did she sound like? Whom did the Muslims feel was standing there? Zainab? Imam Ali. So when Bibi Zainab would speak in the court of Ubaidullah or the palace of Yazid, the Muslims who were there, some of them were old and they had been there at the time of Imam Ali and Rasulullah. And when they heard Bibi Zainab talking, they could remember when Imam Ali was speaking, and they remembered that Imam Ali and Rasulullah were very close, and it brought them to realize what had happened was not good, was not the right thing. Yazid took the captives into an old building, was like a dungeon where there was very little shelter from heat or cold, and the conditions in there were terrible. That is where he imprisoned them for a short time. Now, remember we spoke about the victory of the battle. It seems like Yazid was victorious because Yazid's army survived and Imam Hussein's army, or Imam Hussein's companions and family members, were all shaheed or killed. Although it may seem like Imam Hussein lost and Yazid won, this is only from the surface. This is only the way it looks like, because Yazid had a military victory. However, when we look closely at which side accomplished their goals, then we see that Imam Hussein and the Ahlul Bayt were the ones who were victorious. Let us see why. So on principle, Imam Hussein had refused to give allegiance to Yazid. Do you remember? This was how this all began. What was the Arabic word for allegiance? Isa? Bay'ah. What does it mean to give allegiance or to give bay'ah? It means to agree that you are going to support or stand by or be committed to someone. So Imam Hussein did not want to give allegiance or bay'ah to Yazid because Yazid was a cruel and non-Islamic person. Yazid did not do things the Islamic way. Okay, he was not a good Muslim leader, and Imam Hussein said he would never stand by someone who was like that, even though it meant that he would be martyred while he was proving that. So Imam Hussein died standing up for Islamic principles and in the way of Allah. What is that in Arabic? Fi sabilillah. And so as such, Imam Hussein accomplished his goal. Imam Zainul Abidin and the women of the Ahlul Bayt openly and vocally challenged Ubaidullah ibn Ziyad and Yazid in their palaces. Remember those khutbah that they gave? When they delivered those khutbahs and those sermons, they showed the people who were there, including Yazid and Ubaidullah, the truth of what had happened. And this was something else that nobody was doing at that time. Yazid was not saying anything about the truth. Yazid's army did not admit to the fact that they were wrong. And when Imam Zainul Abidin and Bibi Zainab spoke up, the people began to realize that something very wrong had happened. And then they started to realize that they had to follow the lead of the Ahlul Bayt. They had to follow the Ahlul Bayt's path and stand up against Yazid. Once the Ahlul Bayt returned to Medina, Yazid imprisoned them for a while. Now, it is in the history books, we're not sure whether it was a few months or whether it was a year, that time period of imprisonment. But when they were released and they returned to Medina, one of the first things Bibi Zainab did was to hold a majlis like this one, where she gathered people, whoever would come and listen. And what they did was azadari of Imam Hussein and all the shuhada of Karbala. They talked about what had happened. They narrated the events of the day of Ashura and what had happened before it. They cried, they mourned, and they remembered Imam Hussein. This woke more people in the Muslim Ummah to Yazid's cruelty and oppression. And what began to happen was that people began to decide to rebel against Yazid. Yazid sent huge armies towards the people who were beginning to rebel. And he also sent huge armies to the cities of Mecca and Medina. His army even set fire to the Kaaba. Now, this was the sort of leader Yazid was. 3 years after killing Imam Hussain, Yazid died. His true character was revealed, and the Muslims realized that he had not been practicing Islam. Imam Hussein's mission to save Islam had been successful, and he had achieved this by his rebellion or by his refusal to give bay'ah to Yazid. Yes, Imran. There were lots of things Yazid did which were not Islamic. Yes. I know. Let's finish this lesson, because otherwise we'll run out of time to do our test yourselves and so on, because there's 2 here today. Okay, so as a result of all these different things, what happened was that the Muslims rose against the Umayyads, the leaders, the caliphs at that time, and soon the Umayyad dynasty or the Umayyad rule was ended. Okay, now we're going to talk about that in tomorrow's majlis, inshallah. 1400 years after his martyrdom, Imam Hussain is still remembered for his sacrifice on the day of Ashura. We are here remembering Imam Hussain, isn't it? We consider him a role model for fighting in the way of Allah against injustice. On the other hand, who remembers Yazid? Does anyone go to do ziyarah of Yazid when they go to Karbala? Does anyone go to see Yazid's grave? No. He's remembered, he was infamous. He was remembered for all the wrong reasons. He is not remembered because he was a likable or good character. Okay? So, do you see that victory really was not Yazid's, it belonged to Imam Hussain? Okay, so very quickly, every lesson we always talk about how we can put our faith into action. And one of the things that we can learn from what happened in Karbala is that even, and what happened on Sham-e Ghariba to Bibi Zainab, Imam Zainul Abidin, and all the women and children, is that even though everything can be taken away from us, as their belongings were taken away from them, they didn't have any, they lost their family members, they lost all their belongings, they lost their tents, and even their dignity was taken away from them because they were tied up and treated as prisoners and slaves, and they were paraded through the streets. All these things were taken away from them, yet did they say that they would follow Yazid? Did they do bay'ah with Yazid just so that they would be freed? No. They stood by their principles and their faith, and they were patient, and they believed in Allah. So this reminds us that we cannot always control what happens to us, but we always have the freedom to choose how we react when things happen to us. And over the last few nights, remember that we have spoken about how in every circumstance we should be grateful and thankful to Allah. What were the three things Imam Zainul Abidin, was it Imam Zainul Abidin who said that story about how to say Alhamdulillah all the time? Was it Imam Zainul Abidin? I think it was. Imam Zainul Abidin had said, when you are given something, you should say Alhamdulillah. When something is taken away from you, you should say Alhamdulillah. And when you don't get anything, you should say Alhamdulillah. So in every circumstance, you should always be grateful to Allah. Now, did you know that 3 Imams were present in Karbala? We have mentioned this. Imam Hussain was there, his son Imam Zainul Abidin was there, and Imam Muhammad al-Baqir was a very young boy at that time, but he was not an Imam at that time, but he was present in Karbala. Okay, so this activity is similar to the one we did on the 10th night, where we have to put things in the order of how they took place. Okay, so The Ahlul Bayt were taken to Ubaidullah ibn Ziyad's palace in Kufa. Imam Zainul Abidin and Sayyida Zainab gave khutbahs to ensure that everyone found out about the injustices that had been perpetrated against them. Yazid sent an army to put a stop to the protests and rebellions. He even violated the sanctities of the holy cities of Medina and Mecca and set fire to the Kaaba. Imam Zainul Abidin was bound in chains, and the ladies of the Ahlul Bayt were taken as captives on the backs of unsaddled camels from Karbala to Kufa. Is this in the right place? It should be at the top, correct? Because that is what happened just the next day after the day of Ashura. 1400 years after his martyrdom, Imam Hussain is still remembered for his great sacrifice and is a role model for fighting against injustice. Do we need to move that? We don't need to move that. The heads of the martyrs were severed and carried on spears. That's the first one, because that happened before the ladies and taken to, correct. The Ahlul Bayt returned to Medina and they informed the Muslims what had happened. Where does this go? Okay, have I done the right, have I moved it? Is that, no? Yep, is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. As a result of the mission, the Muslims rose against the Umayyads and soon the Umayyad dynasty was vanquished. Here?
Yeah.
Imam Hussein's daughter named Ruqayya died here. That was in the prison. So this is before they returned to Medina. She died. Over here, it's after Ubaidullah's palace in Kufa. That happened in Sham, right? The Ahlul Bayt were paraded through the streets of Sham and taken to the palace of Yazid, which was the Umayyad mosques. Yeah, correct. So that is just above Bibi Ruqayya's story. Okay, so I think, oh, here, Umar Saad's army entered the tents of Ahlul Bayt, and that goes right to the top.
Just underneath the sever.
So that's,
Yeah.
so it would be right at the top. Okay, let's try this. So Umar Saad's army entered the tents of the Ahlul Bayt. The heads of the martyrs were severed and carried on spears. Imam Zainul Abidin was bound in chains and the ladies were taken as captives. That's right. You think this goes here?
No.
Well, let's try that. You need to sit down, my dear. Okay. And then the Ahlul Bayt were taken to Kufa. Then they were taken to Sham. Then Bibi Ruqayya died. Then the Ahlul Bayt were returned to Medina. Then Yazid sent an army to stop the rebellion. As a result of the mission, the Muslims rose, and 1400 years after is now. Are we happy with this? I think we'll try this and let's see what happens.
They were paraded before they were taken to the palace. They were paraded before they were taken to the palace.
No, they were first taken to Kufa and then they were taken to Sham. Okay, they were taken to Kufa first and then. Correct. They were taken to Kufa first and then they were taken to Sham after that. Okay. Oh, okay. So let's see. So the heads of the martyrs were severed first. And then Umar Saad's army entered the army and looted the children. Then they were bound. Then they were taken to Ubaidullah's palace in Kufa. Then they were taken to Sham. Okay. So I think it was just those two that we got, those three that we had at the beginning that were wrong because of that slight. Okay, that's okay. Okay, let's go to the next page. Let's sit down, please. Okay, one of the people in Kufa who rebelled against Yazid was somebody called Mukhtar, and we're going to talk about Mukhtar
I watched the TV
tomorrow.
show.
Oh, did
That's what I
you?
was going to talk about.
Oh,
That's where I got all my facts from.
oh, really? Did you see it? Okay.
It's Persian and Urdu.
Okay. Well, okay. Key facts of what happened. So on the day of Sham-e Ghariba, the tents of Imam Hussain and the women and children were plundered. That means that things were taken away from them and they were set on fire. The surviving members of the caravan, which included Imam Zainul Abidin, Imam Muhammad Baqir, women and children, Bibi Zainab, they were all taken as captives first to Kufa and then to Sham. And all along on the journeys, Imam Zainul Abidin and Bibi Zainab and other ladies in the caravan, even Bibi Sakina used to tell stories about the events of Ashura and what had happened to as many people as they could. And when people learned about all the things that had happened to the Ahlul Bayt, they rebelled and rose against Yazid. In his 3 years as the Khalifa after Ashura, Yazid violated the sanctity of the Ahlul Bayt and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Okay, so the last thing is that we're going to do this test yourself. Okay, please don't call out the answers. You can put your hand up. So what does Sham-e Ghariba mean? Let's see. Okay. Okay, Zainab. Night of the Dispossessed. Which of the following took place on the night after Ashura for it to be called Sham-e Ghariba? So there's four things. The army of Umar Saad entered the tents of the Ahlul Bayt and looted the belongings of the women and children. Did that take place? Yes. The tents were set on fire. The ladies and children were forced to sleep outside in the cold desert air, hungry and thirsty. Were the ladies and children given water and food? No. So is it
1, 2, and 3.
okay. 1, 2, and 3? Okay. Remember, no calling out, so everyone gets a chance to raise their hands. Which of the family of Imam died in the dungeons of Yazid's palace? Okay. Yes. No. Which of Imam Hussein's family died in the prison in Yazid's palace? Yes. Sorry. Yes, you. No, she didn't die there. Okay, you, Imran. Sayyida Ruqayya. And which members of the family of Imam Hussain were present at Sham-e Ghariba? Was it Sayyida Zainab, Kulthum, Imam Zainul Abidin, Sayyida Zainab, Imam Hussain, Imam Zainul Abidin, Kulthum, Hazrat Ali Akbar, Sayyida Zainab, Imam Ali, Imam Hassan, Imam Hussain? No. So it is yes, the first one. Okay. Which of the following options was not a reason as to why Imam Hussain was victorious? On Islamic principle, Imam Hussain refused to give allegiance to Yazid and he died in the way of Allah. That is true. So it is a reason why Imam Hussain was victorious because he didn't give allegiance. So it's not the answer we're looking for. Imran, you need to sit down, please, on your chair because everyone has to be socially distancing. As a result of Imam Hussein's mission, the Muslims rose against the Umayyads and the Umayyad dynasty was vanquished. So that was a victory for Imam Hussain. Yazid realized he had wronged the Ahlul Bayt and apologized. Did that happen? No. Let's see the last one. Imam Zainul Abidin and the women of the Ahlul Bayt challenged and stood up to Yazid and Ubaidullah in their palaces. Did that happen? So we'll go for this one because that never happened. Okay, I think we could have got them all right. Okay, so good listening, everyone, and well done. That's the end of today's lesson. Tomorrow we'll be talking about what happened in the longer term after and how this rebellion against Yazid took place. So we'll be talking about Mukhtar and how the Muslims came together to rebel against Yazid and remove the Umayyad dynasties. Okay, now before we end, let us do what we do every night, which is our ziyarat. Okay, let's read it all together. Assalamu ala al-Hussein wa ala Ali ibn al-Hussein wa ala awlad al-Hussein wa ala ashab al-Hussein. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. If you did the Amal of Ashura, you would have heard this during the Amal because we recited it during the Amal. Okay, you can go back quietly to your parents now, please, and see you tomorrow night, inshallah. Quietly. No, you can't stay here because we are all going next door. You need to keep your masks on. Amina, is your mom here today? Okay, so you can go and sit with mom.